Hi, it's Steph, and today we're going to talk about shade plant combinations, and I'll show you some that I currently have in my garden, and we'll also work on planting some more. We are here in my Japanese maple garden, and over the last couple of years, as we've built this garden and the trees start to grow, it's casting more shade. And when people think of shade gardens, the first plant that usually comes to mind are hosta. And I do have some hosta planted here underneath this Ariadne Japanese maple. And while I really do love all of the colors that hosta come in, they come in so many different sizes as well as colors, I deal with deer in my garden. So it is really difficult for me to keep hosta thriving without them getting mowed down by deer unless I regularly spray repellents. So for that reason, I've started to look for other plants that are more deer resistant in my garden and that also provide a lot of color and texture in a shady spot. So let me show you some combinations that I have, and I will start back here in this bed. This was the first one that I started adding perennial plants to, and I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. Now, as plants grow, you often have to move things around, and that is the case with this bed. I moved some pulmonaria here, or lungwort, last season, and you can see that it's filled out quite a bit, and it is now covering some of my heuchera. So I will have some moving to do. But what I want to bring your attention to is the fact that I have so many colors in this area that is shady with just the use of foliage color. So I have this pulmonaria, which blooms earlier in the spring in these little purple and pink bell-shaped flowers. But once the blooms are done, they get these really large silvery leaves. There are different varieties of pulmonaria. This one happens to be called silver bouquet. And you can see how beautiful and large this foliage is. Now, I really love the contrast of the pulmonaria with some heuchera. And I have a couple of different heucheras here. This one is the Dolce Wildberry. I also have a peach variety. And one of my favorites is the silver gumdrop, right back here. I have these all backed up by this guacamole hosta, and you can see between the foliage and color of the hosta, as well as the color of the heuchera and the lungwort, there's a difference in not only color, but in texture, and it all makes for a really beautiful contrast. And here is a plant that I just added last season as well, and it is a Ascot Rainbow Euphorbia. And what drew me to this plant was the variegation. You can see that it has a really beautiful green and this limey yellow on the edges. And this plant put out all of these blooms really early on in the season. I want to say probably March here in my Zone 6 garden. March or April. But nonetheless, I thought that these blooms were really pretty, and now that they're starting to go over, I can cut them down. But this plant just offered even another layer of texture and different foliage, as well as color in this garden space.
It's evergreen.
It is evergreen. So George is learning a thing or two. Now this stood evergreen for me here in my Zone 6, and Ascot Rainbow Euphorbia is listed as being hardy to a Zone 7. So I was really happy to see it not only thrive through the winter, where it got sort of like a reddish color, but it also stayed alive and put out these blooms for me and is growing. So really great plant. When it comes to shade plant combinations, not only do they look beautiful in your landscape, but they also work really well in shade containers. These are the Corten steel planters that we just planted up recently when we redid this patio space. And you can see here that I used the Hakonakloa, which is the Japanese forest grass, which is offering a lot of movement and texture in this bright yellow color. A fern that has even another type of texture and color, as well as this Grape Expectations Coralbella heuchera in this purple burgundy color to add a little bit of depth with the color. So you can see there are three very different plants that all like shade in this container, playing really nicely together, and I think they look really beautiful as a combination in a planter. When you see plants in combination like this in a container, you can use that as inspiration to plant those same combinations out in your garden. So let me show you a spot that I have the same plants used in combination over here. I have a Hakonakloa, or Japanese forest grass, right in this corner. I also have some heuchera, both the caramel heuchera as well as some dark foliage heuchera. And right behind the stone, I placed some Godzilla fern, which is currently my favorite fern. So seeing combinations in containers really provide a lot of inspiration for how things would look grouped together out in the garden. So I really love the way that this combo works nicely together. Now, if you have a garden space that is still getting a little bit of sun and some shade, so a shade part sun, which is sort of what I have in this area here. The sun comes from the back, and then by the afternoon, it is in the front of this garden. There are also some plants that you can plant for color and foliage and texture that work really nicely with a shade part shade garden. And here I have some lady's mantle or Alchemilla mollis. Now, I grew these from seed last year, and you can see we had some rain overnight. How beautifully this foliage holds on to raindrops. It did just finish blooming in June, and it gets these really pretty sprays of chartreuse, kind of yellow-green flowers. But this is another great plant for either a sunny garden or a part shade garden. So because this area still gets some sun, it will still bloom for me. And when it's not in bloom, it provides a lot of pretty color and texture with the foliage. And one of my favorites that is absolutely beautiful and gets really large, and the deer don't touch because it has textured foliage, but this is lamb's ear, and the variety is the Helen von Steen. And what's great about the Helen von Steen is that it doesn't bloom. I will say that the whole time I've had it, it did send out one bloom stalk, but it never bloomed. It just looked like a stalk that I cut off, and that was the end of it. But it does spread horizontally and quite large. These have gotten about 3 by 3 in size, but they make a really great ground cover. And as you can see, the color is beautiful. Has this like blue gray color, and it just makes a really nice border plant. So if you have an area that is part shade, part sun, or even full sun, this would be a wonderful plant. And the color plays also so nicely with things like heucheras and ferns and hosta. Let me show you some new plants that I'm going to work on planting in this area today. So a couple of months ago, when I had taken you over to Home Depot to do a store tour, I had found some of these quart-sized proven winners plants, and specifically I found this Bergenia called Miss Piggy. Now, Bergenia is also known as pig squeak, and the reason I wanted this plant is because it's an earlier bloomer. So this blooms in the spring, and it also has this really large, shiny green foliage. So I thought that this would make a really pretty companion plant paired with this dark side of the moon astilbe that I have planted in this area. Now you can see that I prefer dark mulch, and with the dark mulch and the dark side of the moon astilbe, the foliage on the astilbe is not as noticeable. So I think that if I interplant it with this contrast of the shiny green foliage, I think it'll really make the astilbe pop. And the other great thing is that the astilbe looks beautiful all the time because of the foliage, but it also sends up bloom stalks in the summer. So while the Bergenia will bloom in the spring and then just have foliage color, the astilbe will have the interest with the foliage, but then it will bloom in the summer. So I am getting different bloom times from this pairing here, as well as different color foliage and different texture foliage. So here's my plan for the Bergenia or the pig squeak. I'm going to plant one there, one here, and one here to create sort of a drift. And let me go ahead and show you some of the other plants that I picked up. Some Tiarella. Now this is a really beautiful plant. It's also called foam flower. It gets these really pretty sprays of blooms in the spring, late spring, and it's called Sugar and Spice. So I thought that the foliage was really beautiful with this dark center, and I have 3 of these. So I'm going to find a spot to put the grouping of those. I also have another one of this Grape Expectations Coral Bells that I had purchased to put in my containers here, the quart and steel planters, but I have an extra, so I'm going to tuck this somewhere as well. And actually you can see how that even looks really beautiful together. And I've been after one of these for a little while. This is a gold foliage dicentra or bleeding heart. And so I finally found one at a local to me nursery. It is called Gold Heart Old Fashioned Bleeding Heart. So the gold heart is the gold foliage variety. And I also want to add this to this Japanese maple garden space. Now these are a fairly large perennial. They get to be about 18 to 24 inches in height, and they need 24 to 36 inch spacing. So this one you can almost plant as a standalone, kind of like a statement perennial. While I have a plan for where I'm planting the Bergenia, I have no idea where any of these are going to go. So I'm going to work on planting the Bergenia. I'm going to find a place for all of these, and then I will show you where they end up. All right, I'm done planting. Let me show you how things turned out. I actually decided to plant the sugar and spice tiarella in this space as well. So I started kind of a new drift of plantings in this area, and you can see how well those colors are going to work together because the tiarella has both the green and the dark center, which pulls on the dark foliage of this dark side of the moon astilbe. You can see that the astilbe is actually blooming and looking really pretty. And I'm going to go around the other way to show you from the other side. And I put this singleton here, which also looks like a really great contrast to the dark center of that tiarella. And as I get more coral bells, I can continue the drift here in this spot. But coming around the corner here, you can see that I have the tiarella in the background. That is, again, the sugar and spice variety with the dark side of the moon astilbe, and then the shiny broadleaf foliage of the bergenia or the pig squeak interplanted. And as I was planting these, I thought that a yellow Japanese forest grass, the Hakonocloa all gold, would look really nice in this space here. And even some silvery ferns along the edge here, or some pulmonaria that I actually already have in my garden that I can transplant over. But because it's going to be way too hot this week, I am not going to transplant anything. I just planted these here because it is in a shade spot. And as long as I keep them watered, they will do just fine. And here's my plan for the gold heart bleeding heart. Right in this bed here, in that spot, I have an Ito peony. And this year it didn't bloom. And I'm suspect it's because this Ariadne Japanese maple might be casting a little bit too much shade on it. So I'm going to go ahead and transplant it. But because it's too hot currently to transplant, I'm going to leave it be. And once I'm able to find a spot for it, I will move it out of that space. And I'm going to plant the gold heart bleeding heart in that area. So this is what it would look like. And I think that it'll look really great here. Plus the bleeding hearts can take part sun. And because it has that gold foliage, I think it'll be a nice bright plant in this spot. I'm taking a break, having a drink, and George is helping me with the watering in of these newly planted plants, which keeping them happy over the next week or two while it's really warm shouldn't be a problem because we are already in the habit of watering all of these potted Japanese maples and these new corten steel planters. So thank you so much for spending your time with us, and I will catch you in the next one.
Look. So these are our overwintered plants, and they're mostly doing pretty well. It even looks like the roses are starting to get a couple of buds that are swelling, and the sedum is holding up. Everything's looking pretty good. So we've just been coming in here and watering maybe once a month.
Every 3 weeks.
Every 3 weeks. Usually George
I have
takes
a timer on my phone.
Yeah, George takes care of that for me because I always complain that it's too cold out. I have to make dinner, whatever the case. I usually get him to come out and help me with this. So thanks for keeping our plants alive, George.
No problem.
I came out here to check in the shed if I have any planters that I can use in the front porch clustered pots project. And of course, I got stopped in my tracks by the magnolia. But you can see that we have now moved out all of the plants that we had overwintered in the shed. We had the roses as well as Japanese maples. And now that our temperatures are more consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, those have now gone outside to get acclimated and also to get watered by the rain. Here are all the roses and the Japanese maples as well as that tricolored beech that we overwintered. So everything's looking really good, but it was starting to get a little bit warm in there, and these roses are a lot more ahead than the ones that we have out in the garden. So it was time to get them outside to kind of slow them down a tiny bit. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit the thumbs up button, and please consider subscribing so you don't miss any of my future videos. And we'll see you soon.